Hello and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to re-customize this box into a hopefully cute looking Mimic dice box. As you can see, I actually customized this box before, but I wasn't really too happy with how it came out. Like, for a while I really thought it was cute, but I'm not using it that often anymore, and I thought, you know, this has the perfect size for a set of dice, so why not make a cute Mimic box out of it? I always actually wanted to try that with a chest or box, and, you know, had this lying around, so I thought this would be perfect. The first thing I did was sand it down a bit, since there's a lot of varnish on there and I want stuff to stick to it. And then I'm going to use Sculpey Original to make some basic things that I'm gonna pre-bake for the sculpt. Starting with some half-round spheres for the eyes. And then I'm also gonna make some teeth and fangs. These are just very simple. Like, for the latter ones, I just made some little wormy dealies, tapered them on one side and shaped them in the correct shape, trying to like keep them a bit more symmetrical. And then I'm doing that with a lot of other teeth. And all of these are gonna be pre-baked, so I can later on just shove them into the gums without having to worry about them deforming or being floppy. And I don't have to worry about when they are baking that they will like close the box cause they are bonding with like one of the sides. Next up, it was time to actually sculpt on the box. So I glued down the eyes with some super glue, and then I just started using wormy dealies and sheets of this Sculpey Original. Normally I don't use the stuff very much as it's quite stiff, but for the texture I'm going with and like the shapes I'm going for, I thought this would actually be way more fitting than the Sculpey medium that I normally prefer, just because it is actually a bit more stiff and it will give a bit more rugged and more natural look hopefully when I blend it in, as opposed to the Sculpey medium, which you can blend in much easier, so it may lose this like more naturally a bit uneven look. So I actually was inspired kind of by a mix of, I want to say spiders and maybe some bat like things, shapes. So I wanted to have front-facing eyes. I first thought I wanted to have them facing up, but I decided against it. I decided to go with front-facing. So I'm gonna just cut away the front bit of the eyelid that I made, indent it a bit to like free up the eyeball, and then I'm gonna add some wormy dealies as just eyelids on top, and I'm gonna blend them in a bit more. Of course, this creature needs some wrinkles too, so I'm gonna also add some more wormy dealies all around and blending them in before going into detailing it with my silicone shaper. And then lastly, it's just about like shaping a little nose, so for that one I actually was really inspired by bats and they're like more triangular nose. So I went in, made like little triangles, separated them a bit with my silicone shaper tool and gave it some nostrils before like manipulating it a little bit more until I liked the shape. And that's basically all for the head. I decided to not sculpt on the sides just to make it a bit more easy to store it. The fangs in front are already gonna make it harder, and I didn't want to have any trouble of like opening this or having too much weight since the stuff is pretty heavy. But I decided to use this instead of epoxy sculpt since this is wood and the hinges are metal, so I'm not worried about anything like melting in the oven or like releasing fumes or anything. I know that my acrylic varnish I used certainly doesn't have that problem. I used that many times before, so since I know which material has been used for glazing, I'm not worried about putting that in the oven. If you have something pre-painted and you don't know what kind of coating it has, maybe you want to sand it off completely before actually going and putting it in the oven, just to make sure that there's no fumes released that you don't want to have in your lungs. which I'm also using a separate oven just for polymer clay and like projects, so I'm not too worried about actually, you know, having any of that in the oven itself and like tainting any of my food. But yeah, I would always be very careful nonetheless, since the fumes definitely get outside even if you use a separate oven. So just be aware of what you actually put in there and that it's okay to put those materials into the oven. My idea for this mimic is to have it kind of look smiling, showing its like big fangs and his row of teeth. So I'm gonna add some gums, and I'm not gonna really add lips. I'm gonna define them later. So instead I'm just gonna blend into Wormy-Dailies, one larger one on top because I want the fangs that are really big to have something to hold on to. And then a little bit of a smaller one on the bottom, and I'm trying to curve it a bit, so I tapered the edges of this Wormy-Daily before blending it in, just to make it look like it's a bit more smiling. And I think I actually pretty much managed that kind of look pretty well, which makes me super happy, because obviously that's what I was going for. Just like a kind of cute but still kind of terrifying mimic, you know. You know he keeps his dice safe that you give him, but you also know he won't bite you if you're not his enemy and like grabbing the dice. He will just go chomping and munching on your enemies. So for the teeth I basically pre-put them in, especially the large ones, and then I'm using some Bacon Bond just to bond the glaze. I should have put some Bacon Bond underneath these large fangs, because later on I have an issue with like one breaking off, but for the other teeth, like having that connection, it actually worked really well with just the Bacon Bond on the lower parts. Now I noticed quite often that, especially in my like smaller oven, Sculpey Original tends to get a bit darker, but honestly I'm not worried about this at all, because the only time when I wouldn't put any clay back into the oven that has gotten dark is when you take it out of the oven and it's very rigid. This clay was still pretty soft like while it was in the cooling stage, so I'm not too worried about it breaking or getting super fragile. But if you bake it too long, it may definitely get super brittle, and then I would not suggest you putting it in the oven anymore. But I had plenty of times that things in the oven got a bit more dark, even though I used the recommended temperature and times, and sometimes even lower temperature. It's just this type of clay and how it reacts. For Sculpey Medium, that tends to get a bit brown also, especially on the surface, and I think that's just because my heating elements are free heating elements, because it's more of like a pizza oven, and like the tray gets a bit hotter. But I never had any problems with colored Fimo or anything discoloring, which is quite nice, because obviously when you use colored clay, you would want to keep that color. Now, as I mentioned for the gums, I'm just gonna make some tiny indents. They're gonna be a bit smaller, but I think that just exaggerates the like giant mouth with the giant fangs a little bit more. And then I tried to smooth out the surface with some Bacon Bond, but that was way too stiff, so I added some alcohol into the mix. This is just some rubbing alcohol, and that worked pretty well to smooth out the surface. I don't want to smooth it out too much, which is another reason why I prefer this clay to Sculpey Medium in cases like this. And that is just because this clay takes a bit longer to soften. If you put like alcohol or like a Bacon Bond or something onto the clay, it usually gets pretty soft on the surface, and that's how you like even it out. It still got nice and soft on the surface and removed the fingerprints, but it definitely kept a lot of the texture, as you can see from me dry brushing. So what I did is I gave it a black base of acrylic and then just a dry brush of some beastly brown. And I'm using mostly Vallejo modeling colors. I really like those. They're nice and opaque, and they come in a nice variety of colors. And they just work really well for most applications that I'm using them for. And then for the gums, I went in with a lighter red, and I'm going to use some darker and darker washes, multiple coats, just to get the right gum color. And I also decided to paint the inside rim of the box because I thought that would be fitting, since that would be the inside of the mouth. And I'm also going to add some a bit more crumpled up fabric later to give it this more like mysterious look. I don't want it to look too clean on the inside with the fabric. I decided from the beginning I'm either gonna use like some fabric that's a bit softer, or I'm gonna actually sew some inlays that fit, that like have a bit more wrinkles. But I found that I actually have some flexible, more like elastane prone fabric that is actually pretty perfect for this application, and it has a nice purplish color, so I think that will look really nicely. At first I wanted to give the eyes some color, and I'm still gonna do that, but I decided to stray away from the white base coat after I saw it. So basically I applied it, and then later on I'm gonna apply some black again over it, just like I did before with the base coat. I just think it makes more sense for the like spidery eyes. Like I think brighter eyes for like another mimic type monster would fit, but since it's more inspired by spiders, you know, they have pretty dark eyes, I think that's more fitting. Now for the teeth, I went in with some darker brown on the base and then some lighter like sandish color for the top, and that's just gonna be the first layer to cover up like the darker bits, and then I'm going to go over it with some white just to give it pearly whites, and then I'm gonna add some washes later to like stain them and make them look a bit aged and all that stuff. I also couldn't decide if I wanted a tongue or not, but I thought that it may actually get in the way, so my first thought was making like a fabric thong or something, but once I actually saw how it closed up, I thought I didn't really need a tongue at all, and I went against it. Also, the reason why I didn't paint the bottom is that I'm planning on adding some felt later. I just have to pick some new ones up because I don't have enough of like a darker color anymore that would fit. And that is just because when I like to set my chests and stuff on the table, I like them to like not make too much noise, and it's already like a wooden chest, so it will already, you know, clank a bit. And if I put stuff on the inside like dice and I make a fabric to have them not rattle around and get like scratched up too much, which the wood is pretty soft, so I don't think it would do any damage anyways, but I just want to make sure, then why not also add some felt on the bottom. Plus also when you add acrylic, sometimes they tend to get sticky if they sit on a surface for a while, even if you put a matte varnish on them, and I really didn't want that. For the eyes, I decided to blend in some orangey brown, just to give it a slight bit more of color and more friendliness. And I also added some like yellow coffee stain-esque wash for the teeth. And I'm gonna dry brush them in some white later to like give the tips a bit more of that white sheen, because obviously the tips of the teeth, they are used. This mimic is chomping down on unexpected intruders, so of course the parts that, you know, were used the most, like the tip of the teeth, would be a bit more white than the bases close to the gums, and I think that really gives it a bit more of a, you know, I mean, realistic is a hard word, but like, you know, a bit more of a realistic-y look. I also had a hard time deciding if I wanted highlights or not, and I just decided I'm gonna go for them. I'm gonna add a lot of gloss varnish on top anyways, but I think these highlights just make it look way more friendly. And then lastly, I just went over with a very thin light dry brush of this like lighter red that I used as a base coat, just to tie everything back in. And then I applied a wash to make it a bit more like depthly and like more 3D looking, especially on the browner parts. I always like washes because they tend to go a bit more into the crevices again after you add a paint, and they just add a nice bit of depth and detail to an otherwise a bit more flat looking project. Although like after they dry, some of the times it like is hardly noticeable, but in this case it worked out pretty well. I actually hit it with a spray coat of matte varnish. I'm using the Marabu Band One for All varnish, and it works pretty nicely for this. Needed a bit of time to dry, but in this humid weather it's not surprising. And I did use multiple thin coats, making sure I sprayed the teeth also from the inside, because I know they're scratching against each other, and I didn't actually prime any of the clay, and I know it's a bit more of a slick surface, so it's gonna be like prone to rubbing off color, which a bit I don't mind, but I want to avoid like it really chipping off. As I said, for the fabric I chose a more flexible one, so I had to fray check the edges, which I use with this fray check. It basically feels a bit like when you apply super glue or like get a super glue drop on your clothes, but it doesn't change the color too much. It turns it only like a little bit darker, and it worked pretty well for my sewing projects before, so I'm gonna use it here too. And then I'm gonna glue down the edges a bit more before adding more gloss varnish. For the nose, in all cases I worked on it for coloring. I actually am using my fingers to like dab it on and like blend it in a bit. You can of course use a sponge. I just feel like I have a bit more control with my fingers, which is why I did that for the varnish and for when I added the light pinkish blush to the nose. And then of course I'm gonna add some of this gloss varnish on the inside, on the teeth, and yeah. That happened. It's okay, I glued it back on, and nothing happened afterwards. I just like sealed it a bit with the varnish and had to break it free, and yeah, it broke off, but with some super glue it held pretty well. Also, I made sure to make the gloss varnish not touch the inside rim too much, because I don't want it to stick together when I want to open it after like weeks of not using this, because gloss varnish tends to do that, as I mentioned. And with that I'm basically done. I decided to not clean up the clasp, because with use it's gonna scrape off the paint anyways, and I kind of like this messy look. Kind of, you know, like it spilled some things on the clasp. And I decided to not paint it because I know like most paints won't hold on this type of metal. I tried before and they just come off, and then you have flakes of paint on your fingers, so it's not worth it much, and the like brassy gold tone kind of fits the teeth, so I just left it. But I think this little mimic turned out absolutely adorable. Like, I have some clearance issues with the right fang like rubbing a bit against the lower tooth, but it's not really snagging, it's still really easy to open, so I'm not worried about anything happening. And the box itself, like, it works perfectly, it stays open nicely, it's not too heavy despite all the clay I added, and you know, my dice don't clank around in it too much because of the fabric. And just look at this cute smile. And with that, of course, I wish you all a happy Halloween, or whatever, you know, you celebrate around this time of year, and hopefully a happy end of October. I'm honestly in love with this, and it's so simple, and like, you know, decorating boxes like this with clay. These boxes are usually super cheap. I think I paid like $1 for this at a dollar store, and you know, most of them are like pure wood with like some metal hinges and a clasp, so they definitely can go in the oven. And you can find all kinds of different shapes of these, and you know, just go wild and customize them. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and also let me know, did it inspire you, and which kind of mimic-esque creatures would you merge together to make like a mimic box like this? Or how in general would you customize or have customized the dice box? And of course, one last thing is, as many of you may have noticed, this channel actually reached over 1,000 subscribers, and I just want to say a huge thank you to you all who support me. I'm super grateful for all your watching, and I'm super happy to see that as many people are actually interested in what I'm doing and maybe getting inspired by it, and you know, watching it to get ideas for their own projects and stuff. It really makes me happy. I'm so over the moon. So actually, to celebrate this, I want to do a Q&A, and I did a community post a bit earlier when I hit the 1K. So feel free to leave your questions down in the comments of that. I already have some, and I'm really excited to answer all of them in a upcoming video. And of course I'm gonna answer some basic things like what will change with this number for this channel, or will anything change at all, and things like that. And as always, I hope you all have a lovely day. See you next time. Bye bye!